Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm truly honored and humbled, I would like to say, to be able to present my lecture today in this fine, fine institution. The way the presentation, the way my lecture is structured, or the theme that I've chosen, might seem a bit odd, because I'll be talking mostly about a book by a prominent Polish philosopher who is sitting here next to you. So he should be talking about the book and not me. However, let me explain why I've chosen this this topic. So the lecture will not be so much on the main thesis of what Andrzej wrote in his book Prześniona, rewolucja, the revolution of the Sleepwalkers, although I will try to summarize its main argument. The lectures arose initially when I was asked by an international journal to write something about the current intellectual history in Poland, like the intellectual history of the Polish academia, Polish public sphere, and whatever. And I realized, yeah, this is the book, and I realized that this might be probably the best case study to try to somehow sketch out how what I would like to call in my lecture the Polish critical theory after '89 developed, and how it's structured and how it looks like. This book it's not only a bestseller, it's one of the most commented, most quoted, most cited publications in last 20-something, if not 30-something years. And for this very reason, it amounts to a very interesting and important case study in how critical theory in Poland looks like nowadays. And there is a second reason why I'll be commenting on the book, is that it happens so that I started working for Andrzej, so I'll be talking about my boss today, which is not a very, which is an interesting position to be in. However, it turned out that Andrzej, being a foremost theoretician of psychoanalysis in Poland as a philosopher, and me starting or trying to bring back contemporary discussions on Marxist theory in a country where Marxism is not the most popular academic discipline, let's call it like that. The coming together of those two traditions is somehow unique in the Polish field, meaning there is one research group which tries to maybe not combine, but where those two currents clash and complement each other. And the very fact that someone who is doing philosophical work on psychoanalysis and someone who's trying to do philosophical work that stems from Marxist tradition try to work together is, I think, in itself interesting. And I'll be trying to comment on his psychoanalytical perspective, psychoanalytical theory from a maybe not orthodox, but more classical Marxist perspective. And I think that what can come out from this juxtaposition could be in itself interesting and could tell you more about what's the, let's say, state or what's the stakes of some of the discussions that are being held nowadays in Poland. So this is treated, what I'm telling you today, as a kind of analysis and a symptomatic analysis of how some discussions are being framed and commented on in contemporary Polish academic field. Let's call it like this. So just let me begin. I'll try to read to be as brief as possible. So Andrzej Leder's Prześniona, rewolucja, the revolution of the Sleepwalkers, was an attempt, or as the subtitle of the book says, an exercise in the historical logic to rethink the historical transformations of Polish society between 1939 and 1953, and the deeper symbolic legacies they left behind. Leder argues that the revolution in Poland did take place in these years, one that was violent, sweeping, and reshaped social relations, but was done by the Nazi occupying forces and the Red Army, and therefore experienced by most Poles as if in a dream. In other words, the revolution was never fully internalized, reflected upon, or consciously embraced. It remains, in his vocabulary, a revolution of the sleepwalkers. By framing the period's transformations through the concepts of Jacques Lacan's psychoanalysis, Leder seeks not only to retell events, but to explore how the revolution's symbolic dimensions were suppressed and misrecognized. First of all, by the hegemonic social class in modern Polish society, meaning the post-transformative middle class. His central critique is that the Polish society, by that he means the dominant middle class, continues to suffer from a kind of historical amnesia or repression. The events of the 1940s and early 1950s remain under-articulated in collective memory, producing dysfunctions in the way the middle class approaches its own position and its own genealogy. And I might add that the German translation of the book has appeared some time ago, right? And soon you'll be able to read the French edition, so you can already check on your own how loyal I am to the main thesis of the book. The aim of my presentation will not be so much to confront Leder's thesis itself, but rather the fact that a book describing what was probably the most turbulent and profound transformation of Polish society in the 20th century was written in the language of psychoanalytic theory. I believe that this fact is of considerable importance both for how the main thesis of the revolution of the sleepwalkers was formulated, and also for how Leder's work functioned in the Polish public sphere. The theoretical or conceptual reason for separating the thesis of the book from the conceptual apparatus in which it was formulated is the fact that the thesis of the Sleepwalkers' revolution, so a revolution carried out from above and passively experienced by the subordinate classes, is structurally similar to Gramsci's notion of passive revolution. Nevertheless, the Italian Marxist does not appear in the book itself, nor was he generally referred to in the rich reception of the book. From what I've read, I haven't found any reference to Gramsci in many reviews, articles that somehow refer to Andrzej's book. This proximity of Gramsci's concepts to Leder's analysis, and at the same time the significant absence of the former, seem to rise to the rank of a symptom that says a lot about both the specificity of the subject, meaning the Polish passive revolution of 1939-1953, and about the contemporary theoretical field in Poland. It is this symptomatic intertwining that is the subject of my lecture today. So now I'll try to say some things about the main thesis of the book. Leder argues that the two linked processes constitute the Polish revolution. The revolution of the sleepwalkers. Firstly, the Holocaust and the destruction of the Jewish middle class, primarily through Nazi genocide. And secondly, the post-war transformations that eliminated the landed gentry, the ziemiaństwo, and reordered property relations under Stalinist rule. These two processes together shattered the prior social order, landowners and the Jewish bourgeoisie, petit bourgeoisie, and opened up space for new social configurations. Leder sees the elimination through violence and institutional state-led change of these two pillars of the old symbolic hierarchy as central to the possibility of massive social mobility and a new class formation. In his view, the Holocaust constituted a structural rupture. Its aftermath permitted the seizure of property, the reallocation of capital, and the reconfiguration of social institutions. For many Poles, entry into modern social life came over a Jewish corpse, meaning the material and symbolic infrastructure of modernity in Poland had been significantly shaped by the destruction of the Jewish population. Parallel to that, the Stalinist regime, through nationalization, collectivization, and bureaucratic redistribution, crushed the land-owning elites and imposed a new property order. Leder treats this as part of the same revolution, continuing that discontinuities began in the war years. Together, these processes operated from above, with limited conscious input from the broader society, which is why the transformation was experienced as a ghostly, half-realized revolution of the sleepwalkers. However, Both of these processes greatly benefited the popular masses and opened the possibility of the development of new middle classes in Polish society. One of Leder's key claims is that the emergent social group that we now call the post-1989 middle class was in large part constituted not by the old bourgeoisie or intellectual strata, but by peasants and workers who moved to towns or otherwise benefited from the new distribution of property and opportunity. However, Leder contends that this upward mobility was carried out without adequate symbolic legitimation or a prepared identity. The new class lacked the cultural formation, accountability, norms, and symbolic capital of all the elites, and thus wrestles with an ongoing guilt or dislocation over how they attained their position. He sees elastic tension. Those who gain socially and materially often do not fully own their status. They live in ambivalence toward history, toward the symbolic debts of the past, and toward their own subjectivity as political actors. This, he claims, underpins several of Poland's post-1989 maladies: unstable political agency, weak social responsibility, identity confusion, and recurrent recursions of resentment and displacement. However, a signed point should be made here already, one that I will not follow here, but just for the sake of historical accuracy, I need to make that point. That this description of the post-war political trajectory is made mostly from the perspective of Warsaw, Central and Eastern Poland, the former Russian annexed part of the country.
Galicia.
And Galicia, part of Galicia, let's say. I'm from the Western Poland, so you know, I need to make this point.
They are not Poles, in matter of fact.
Yeah, that's true. However, the fact that the experiences of both the elites and the popular classes in, let's say, western part of Poland might have looked differently doesn't really change much in Leder's argument, since it is the perspective of the Congress Kingdom of Poland, with Warsaw as its center, that dominates up till today the memory, history, the understanding and self-understanding of class positions and class conflicts in contemporary Poland. A major portion of Leder's analysis is devoted to the silence around violence, dispossession, and reappropriation. He critiques how the Polish public discourse has often sanitized or omitted the moral ambiguities of restitution, property transfers, and the complicities of individual actors. He draws attention to widespread appropriation of Jewish property during and after the war, claiming that a large proportion of the Polish population gained materially from the transfer, often without acknowledgement or public reckoning. He also examines how anti-Jewish sentiment, both before and after the war, formed a background fantasy through which resentment and symbolic legitimacy were wrought into new hierarchies. Leder further argues that the suppression of these painful memories fuels cycles of compulsive repetition in public life, recurring narratives of victimhood, scapegoating, moral confusion. In his psychoanalytic framing, these repressed or unarticulated dynamics make it difficult for individuals and society to assume full historical agency and conscious responsibility. One of the key elements of his argumentation regarding the mechanisms of repression at work in the history of the Polish passive revolution is the phenomenon of the trans-passive participation in violence, an argument that I find most compelling and the key argument in the whole book. If there is something that might differentiate the revolution of the Sleepwalkers from other known European passive revolutions, is probably the scale of violence, but also the mode of participating in it. Polish society has witnessed an unbelievable traumatic amount of violence done by the SS or NKVD, in many cases participated in that violence. However, it was not a violence done by this society or in its name, so to speak, but done to it or allowed to be done and to be enjoyed without the subject recognizing themselves and being able to come to terms with this violence as a political or even a revolutionary act. So Leder's book is as much about our past as it is about our present. The sleepwalking revolution still casts a shadow over Poland's contemporary class consciousness. The newly ascendant middle class often sees itself as heirs to a nostalgic pseudo-noble past, like the fantasy about manor houses, patriotic myths, the symbols of the old Schlachta, and so on, even though its material basis lies in the transformations of the mid-20th century, or on the other hand, separates itself completely from the nation's history, indulging in a cosmopolitan lifestyle. Because the foundational revolution was never symbolically processed, this class, the middle class, the dominant middle class, lacks a secure narrative of origin and purpose. Leder suggests that many of Poland's political contradictions stem from this gap: inconsistent attitudes toward capitalism, democracy, social justice, and historical accountability. The hegemonic middle class, unable to understand its own political and historical trajectory, remains bereft of its own political symbols and turns against its own genesis. This thesis should be treated as crucial for understanding the current constellation of class struggles in contemporary Poland, where neither of the classes in clash is able to grasp its own class position in relation to the process of Polish modernization, probably only a part of a bunch of new billionaires that emerged from the Polish transformation. If we were to follow Leder's diagnosis of contemporary class consciousness in Poland, we might say that it is precisely this inability to assume a political stance towards the revolutionary process that shaped modern Polish society that still prevents the middle class to fracture eternally and divide into political positions that would and could have more in common with their political and economic standing in contemporary situation. The principle of reality loses with the dream, or maybe the nightmare, that allows the middle class, oblivious to its internal class divisions, to still daydream its own identity. The revolution of the sleepwalker in this regard, I think, could be treated as the most important example in Poland of what came to be called in more global discourse the Lacanian left, term proposed by Yanis Stavrakakis, I think, in 2007, which basically the book by Stavrakakis tries to describe the more global phenomenon of different leftist theories or post-Marxist theories making use of Lacan. What Stavrakakis does not, at least to my memory, does not make is the analysis of how the function and the role of what he calls the Lacanian left, that it assumed a completely different function in post-socialist states, especially, I would say, in Poland, although I never did a comprehensive comparisons to other post-socialist states. Meaning, and I can tell this from my quite in-depth research of the Polish political philosophy and social theory discourse since 1989, the Lacanian left in Poland, especially Zizek, really took over what could have been, what took over discourses that usually would be expressed in the language of Frankfurt School or Marxist theory or whatever. However, Andrzej's book is first of all an example of an original left Lacanian theory composed in a different country than Slovenia, and more in this part of the world. And secondly, it's very original and unique in the way that it does not construct a separate theory first and then applies it to, let's say, critique of ideology or whatever. It works with the history, and it arises from an analysis of a particular historical dynamic that he diagnoses in the case of the Polish passive revolution. This makes Leder's book an important symptom for analysis of what I would like to tentatively call here Polish critical theory after 1989. This is, of course, a very imprecise term, but it can be used to point to the specificity of discourse in Poland after the transformation, which attempted in various ways to fulfill the task set traditionally before critical theory. This task can be summarized as capturing the structural conditions of life of individuals in a given community, or in modern society in general, in such a way as to reveal the hidden power relations, interests, or repressed violence that shape these individuals' perceptions of the social relations in which they are embedded, in order to reduce the suffering that these individuals experience or inflict within these relations, or rather experience and inflict in these relations. This classic understanding of critical theory can naturally be extended to a very broad spectrum of contemporary theoretical trends in the humanities, philosophy, and social sciences. In Poland after 1989, as in most of the globalized academy, to be honest, discourses that could be classified in that way as critical theory were most often modeled on the Anglo-Saxon paradigm of different kind of studies. This was partly due to the fact that over the past few decades, these discourses had been largely shaped by the American reception of continental theories, especially French post-structuralism, which after being digested by American universities, returned to Europe in a form adapted to the needs of American campuses, as a theory stripped of its political radicalism. If we add to this the specific situation of post-communist countries, where all theories associated with communism or Marxism were particularly strongly exercised, and at the same time conceptual language was largely absent from academic circulation during the period of real socialism, especially psychoanalysis, were rediscovered with great interest after the fall of the state socialism, it is easy to understand why critical theory in Poland after 1989 was largely built on only one of the classic pillars of this tradition, psychoanalysis, with the second pillar, Marxism, being almost completely ignored. This simple observation that Marxism is, or at least was for some 3 decades, mostly absent from debates in Poland after 1989 is essentially trivial. Although tracing the trajectory of this trend and all its effects could yield, I think, quite non-trivial conclusions about the recent intellectual history of Polish academic discourse. Here, we will limit ourselves to drawing attention to Leder's extremely important position, and especially his book on the Polish passive revolution within this trend. This position within the trend I am describing here is symptomatic. Leder's position is symptomatic for at least 2 reasons. Firstly, Andrzej is an author who has contributed significantly to the development of psychoanalytic theory in Poland. In fact, since the publication of his groundbreaking book, Freud's Doctrine in the Age of Zeit, one of the worst titles in history, really. The book is great, but who titles his book Freud's Doctrine in the Age of Zeit? Nobody knows what the book is about, but it's very good.
It is a reason to read it.
Okay, that's an argument I can buy.
You just read the title and that's...
Yeah. So, since the publication of his groundbreaking book on Freud's Doctrine of Unconscious, he has consistently developed psychoanalysis not only as a theory, but above all as an independent model for philosophical reflection. Leder's approach to psychoanalysis, which is deeply inspired by both French post-structuralism, however, read without the mediation of its American reception, and the strong tradition of Polish research on transcendental philosophy, both Kantianism and phenomenology, is a theory of the conditions of possibility for the constitution of the subject, both individual and collective. In this approach, the unconscious ceases to be simply the repressed contents of the individual psychic apparatus and becomes a structural condition for the formation of individual and social actors. However, these very conditions of possibility, that is what is symbolic and real, cannot be directly grasped in this field, hence their unconscious nature. At the same time, Leder found a way to apply his understanding of psychoanalysis to political and social issues. Here, we can already see that his reading of both the psychoanalytic tradition and French post-structuralism was not shaped, and I will stress this again, by the Anglo-Saxon neutralization of these discourses, and remained close to those currents that linked both psychoanalysis and post-structuralism with critical discourses directly concerned with issues of political change, exploitation, and class domination. At the same time, the way in which Leder transforms psychoanalytic discourse into political and social theory reveals the specificity and, at the same time, the limitations of psychoanalysis, a discourse with clinical origins as a language of class analysis. And it's also an important note, what also distinguishes Leder's way of constructing like a left Lacanian theory from what, for example, happened in Slovenia, is that it is already a theory of class formation and class relations. In which, in case, for example, Žižek or Dollar, the class relations are derived from more theoretical debates. In this case, it is already and directly a theory of class struggle and class formation. So, the specificity of this perspective and its limit, and at the same time its limits, is clearly evident in the revolution of the Sleepwalkers. It was not only a work on the it wasn't only a work on the political history of the middle class, social modernization in communist Poland, or the memory of the Holocaust. It was primarily, as we suggested here earlier, a philosophical study on and of political violence. Leder's approach was not to analyze relations of violence in order to minimize or abolish them, which no theoretical work can do, but to confront the readers of his book, meaning the hegemonic class of post-transformation Poland, the new middle class, with the history of violence, with the history of violence, which is the history of its own formation. In this sense, the aim of Prześniona rewolucja is primarily to reveal to a certain social group the hidden violence in the social relations that constitute and reproduce that group, so that this collective subject can be able to politically confront this violence and itself. Leder used psychoanalysis as a social criticism in the form of a therapy, and an attempt to uncover the unconscious history of a class that had completely naturalized its political domination. This has an undeniable advantage, as it allowed him to offer a perspective in which the history of the formation of the middle class in Poland and the history of violence behind it was presented as something that it is presented in the book as something that is basically that constitutes the unconscious of contemporary Polish society. He convincingly shows that in the case of modern Poland, a country struggling with both the history of the Holocaust and the active participation of part of its population, at least in the extermination of Jews, and Stalinist violence, which was also part of the process of modernizing the entire society, that it is precisely the psychoanalytic perspective that is an adequate theoretical language for confronting the contemporary ideology of the Polish middle class, whose naturalization of its own habitus and political beliefs is the result of a complete misunderstanding, or rather repression, of its violent becoming. Nevertheless, the psychoanalytic origins of the conceptual apparatus of the revolution of the Sleepwalkers means that the theory tackling the historical origins of the dominant class in contemporary Poland is presented as a kind of therapy for the class. To put it bluntly, Leder's book is written from a perspective best suited to, in a language best understood by, and for the purpose of a kind of political therapy for the dominant political class in Poland, which is additionally treated in the book as a kind of a monolith, which it certainly is not. From this perspective, it can be seen that Leder's philosophy is indeed a version of critical theory, as it fulfills one of the possible goals or postulates that critical theory can pursue, namely, reducing suffering and increasing empowerment by revealing unconscious relationships of violence, domination, or subordination. In this case, we are dealing with the revelation of repressed violence and the political unconsciousness of the middle class, the process of which could enable this class to confront its own unconsciousness and assume a political position in relation to the reality principle, which in this case it's its real history, its real formation. The psychoanalysis of the Polish passive revolution is a political therapy for the hegemonic class, which is essentially only its goal is essentially only to change the way this class exercises its hegemony. One might claim that this could lead to this class being able to finally create consciously the political alliances it desperately needs, but this postulate is not openly formulated. The relationship between the language, perspective, and the purpose of theory building, one of the fundamental epistemological issues of critical theory, ultimately leads us to question Gramsci's absence from the discussion of the Polish passive revolution. The very concept of sleepwalked revolution, the revolution of the sleepwalkers, although used more as a metaphor than as a technical term, shows a close resemblance to the concept of passive revolution coined by Antonio Gramsci in his prison notebooks. Although Gramsci referred to a much earlier period in the history of a different nation, Italy, and attempted to describe a revolution carried out from above by the bourgeoisie without the participation or with the passive participation of workers and the rural population, so a different class composition. Both passive revolution and Prześniona rewolucja describe a structurally similar process. Participation in the revolutionary process, a change in the class structure of a society, and political empowerment, which took place in a trans-passive manner. That is, without the fully conscious participation of those classes that benefited from the removal of the dominant classes in the revolutionary process. When first Gramsci uses the term passive revolution, it is in a note from November 1930, where he explicitly refers to Vincenzo Cuoco and the failed Neapolitan Revolution of 1799, but at the same time attempts to treat it in a more general sense, already in the first mention of the term. Quote, Vincenzo Cuoco called the revolution that took place in Italy as a repercussion of the Napoleonic Wars he called it a passive revolution. The concept of passive revolution, so I'm saying that it's termed by Gramsci, but in reality it was coined by Vincenzo Cuoco in his remarks on the Neapolitan Revolution of 1799. Gramsci writes further, the concept of passive revolution, it seems to me, applies not only to Italy, but also to those other countries that modernize the state through a series of reforms or national wars or civil wars, without undergoing a political revolution of a radical Jacobin type. End of quote. In later passages from the notebooks, passive revolution is presented as one of the exegetical keys to understand modern history, together with Croce's Storia d'Europa, presented as a treatise on passive revolution, and, which is extremely interesting, as a potential way to theorize fascism. Quote, if liberalism was the form of passive revolution specific to the 19th century, wouldn't fascism be precisely the form of passive revolution specific to the 20th century? End of quote. In the same note from April 1932, it is interesting how the notion of the passive revolution is linked to the fascist version of corporativism and the emergence of new forms of capitalist organization of production. A longer quote. One could think of this thusly. A passive revolution takes place when, through a reform process, the economic structure is transformed from an individualistic one to an economy according to a plan. And when the emergence of an intermediate economy, meaning an economy in the space between the purely individualistic one and the one that is comprehensively planned, enables a transition to a more advanced political and cultural forms, without the kind of radical and destructive cataclysms that are utterly devastating. That might be an important difference between Prześniona rewolucja and the passive revolution. And Gramsci finishes the quote, corporatism could be, or as it grows could become, this form of an intermediate economy that has a passive character, end of quote. Ultimately, Gramsci presents a concept of passive revolution that points towards the inversion of the relation between the popular movement and the state. And to my mind, this is the most important quote in prison notebooks when Gramsci discusses the concept of passive revolution, the most theoretical one at least. This fact is of the greatest importance for the concept of passive revolution. The fact that is that what was involved was not a social group which led other groups, but a state which, even though it had limitations as a power, led the group which should have been leading and was able to put at the latter's disposal an army and a political diplomatic strength. The important thing is to analyze more profoundly the significance of a Piedmont-type function in passive revolutions, meaning the fact that a state replaces the local social groups in leading a struggle of renewal. And the final sentence, and I would like to point your attention to this final sentence, it is one of the cases in which these groups have the function of domination without that of leadership, dictatorship without hegemony. And because this is still a draft and a work in progress, I only have preliminary conclusions to this juxtaposition presented in the lecture. So 3 possible outcomes, or let's say a working hypothesis that I would like to finish my lecture today with. Firstly, the way Leder analyzes the period 1939 till 1953 as a revolution, but the revolution of the Sleepwalkers, could be perceived at the point of departure, or maybe even as a model to analyze the creation of a state form of socialisms in Central Europe, let's say for now, as exactly as passive revolutions in the very broad sense that Gramsci finishes his most theoretical elaboration of the term. Just as fascism was a certain form of passive revolution in pre-war Italy, so maybe the state communism, of course, with all its ideological differences, could be regarded, the formation of state communism could be the history of passive revolution in Central Europe. And to my knowledge, at least, I don't really know any work who would analyze the formation of state communism, at least in Poland or other Central European countries, as passive revolution in Gramscian sense. Secondly, the way Gramsci puts the relation between dictatorship, which could be described here as a taking over the institutions and political apparatuses of the state, and hegemony, in his most theoretical elaborations of the concept of passive revolution, might be a way to describe and retell the history of the Polish passive revolution, not in subjective terms of memory, experience, and position of the middle class, so not as a therapy of this class, but in more objective categories of class domination and hegemony. If the outcome of the passive revolution of instituting Stalin's rule was dictatorship without hegemony, and I think this hypothesis would have some historical merit, especially if we read memoirs of communist politicians from the 1950s and 1960s, they are all preoccupied with the fact that most of the society does not support communist form of state organization. So Gramsci's formulation, dictatorship without hegemony, I think is fitting to what at least they describe as the mode of their administration, the mode of their rule.
In Poland.
Sorry?
In Poland.
In Poland, yeah, in Poland. If the outcome of the passive revolution of instituting Stalinist rule was the dictatorship without hegemony, the ideological effect of the fall of communism was the hegemony of a class which does not understand its dominance as dictatorship. And this is the main ideology of the neoliberal political party in Poland, if not all political parties, that the middle class has hegemony, but there's no dictatorship. It's the natural class to rule the society. There's no dictatorship when it comes to middle class rule in Polish society. Something that, oh my God, what was, oh, I forgot. There's a very famous French Lacanian theorist who coined the term that main ideological form is when a given group is expected as the leading ruling group. Who do I have in mind? We've been talking about him a lot. Lefort. Yeah, it comes from Lefort as the main structure of political ideology. A certain group is destined to rule.
He's Freudian also. He's not so much like him.
Sure. So this is the second working hypothesis. And the third one, the subjective and objective categories of class analysis that are presented here, the revolution of the sleepwalkers and the passive revolution, are not mutually exclusive. However, they do yield different analytical results and do stand in critical relation to each other. The main theoretical claim of Leder's book might be formulated, however, that is the history of the main theoretical claim of Leder's book might be that it is the history of the transpassive violence in case of how a given passive revolution is carried out, and especially in the case of Polish passive revolution, that requires the application of psychoanalytical perspective, a therapeutical approach to the history of class formation, since without it, the repressed history might never be able to be taken into account. So the history of the transpassive violence could be like the theoretical reason why an objective analysis of passive revolution should be supplemented, even if they are in some theoretical contradiction with a more subjective one, being formed as a kind of a political therapy. And that would be all from me. Thank you for your attention.